Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to Mandiant for the opportunity to present to you here today. And thank all of you for coming to my session. I hope that it's helpful, and the views expressed here are mine alone and not those of my employer. Okay, software is eating the world. So Mark Andreessen wrote this back in 2011. And it's true because we are literally building our world on code. We have containers and cloud services, deployments, and endless innovation. But those castles in the sky come at a price. And that price is our increased reliance on third-party code. So open source libraries and shared repositories, because this is the way. And that means we're looking straight into a rising tide of software supply chain compromise that we fail to detect because we trust those sources it's coming from and we don't verify them. Okay, so as we observed with the SolarWinds Orion event, attacks on tech companies, these are trusted third parties for so many of us, and it's been pointed out repeatedly, even with Kevin Mandiant's keynote this morning, our increasing and growing reliance on technology. What happens when we don't have it? Well, that can become the conduit to compromise of our enterprise customers through automated software supply chain updates. And these threat actors leverage things like certificate abuse and code signing. And these are things that we trust to keep us safe. So why should you care? How about a staggering rise year over year in attacks that target shared repositories? So Sonatype issued their annual State of the Software Supply Chain report for 2021. And in it, they showed that there had been an increase of 430% from 2019 going into 2020, and then 650% from 2020 going into 2021. That's significant. And so that's why I wanted to give this talk. I wanted to show you things you might be missing. And I wanted to bring some historical context in to enrich what we already understand. And then I wanted to send you back with some tips and some tools that you can put to work. Now, I will clarify, I am neither a coder nor am I a developer. What I am is a cyber threat intel specialist. I love my job. And what we will do is we will watch the geopolitics play out, and then we'll reach back for historical context, because as we keep learning, history repeats. Now, a series of events over the past 2 years have shown us how easy it is to create confusion and send malicious code through automated deployment mechanisms to the trusting recipients. And yes, we are talking about Chinese and Russian nation-state threat actors. Now, China has been involved in more of these attacks than you may even realize, and they've been actively targeting tech companies in Taiwan because they see them as major competition, and China plays to win. Software supply chain attacks aren't something new. They require skill, resources, and time to execute effectively. And that is the purview of state-sponsored threat actors. So let's pause here for a moment, and I'm going to make an ask of you. As we go through the talk today, I want you to be thinking, what is the weakest link in your software supply chain of trust? Okay. I'm going to use some timelines to help me better tell the story of what's been going on. And then, as an attacker, if you want to do software supply chain compromise, you can come at it by manipulating the source code itself, or you can manipulate the update and deployment mechanisms, or you can modify those compiled releases. You can go after a very specific targeted group, or it can be a broad range of victims. Now, this is a series of attacks on popular open source repositories or repos. And what I wanted to call out is this. I don't think we fully appreciate just how easy it is to obtain third-party source code online and then build it into other software. How safe is that code that we're utilizing? Some of those open source projects are widely used, yes, but that doesn't mean that they're being well maintained, and some of them have even been abandoned. So a question I have for you now is, how aware are you of code reuse, and why is it a thing? It's a good thing. It's a very good thing. It's considered a best practice, and it's a philosophy because it helps developers to more efficiently and more rapidly build their code and test it. They need to be able to do it in small iterations and then load it up into repositories for verification. This is great, but again, what is the price tag for this? Your potential vulnerability to compromised off-the-shelf components. Yes. Now, there are a lot more attacks than what I could fit on this one little slide. But more importantly, there are all the attacks we don't know about. And that brings us here. These are some of the more recent software supply chain events, and there was a flurry of them from 2020 through 2021. And that's what I wanted to call out. Quick question, if you would, and a show of hands if you don't mind. How many of your organizations were impacted by any of these? You may not even be aware of it. So I will cover some of these in a few minutes, but I thought we'd take a walk through a few of them right now. December 2020, and that's Excellion. So this affected their file transfer appliance, and it was a legacy item, but it was in high demand because it's really difficult to securely transfer huge amounts of data. This was being used by governments and banks, major organizations. Well, it had vulnerabilities, and these were targeted, picked out, identified by Fin11, a well-known cybercrime group, and the Clop ransomware gang. And what they did? Well, they compromised that system. And 2 points here. Excellion didn't notify the victims quickly enough, and this created additional damage for their reputation, because we know that when you're involved in a major event, reputation is at risk. So we talk about transparency and the need for quick, effective response. This is a good example. Why? Because there were victims emerging for months after this event. Another attack that I can talk about here is, password state. Password state is an enterprise-level password manager. We all need these. We're all using them. What happened here was we had, how big is it? There's 29,000 customers globally and 370,000 individual users in IT and security. So the update mechanism was compromised by the threat actors. The company was good. They notified the customers and told them that they needed to go in and change all those passwords that had been stored in that system. Just think for a moment how laborious this would be. It's not just you changing your personal passwords. This is your corporate passwords. But another thing I want you to consider is, even if it wasn't you who was using password state for your passwords, what about if one of your trusted third parties was, and the login to your network was being compromised? Then there is Gigaset. Gigaset is a German telecommunications manufacturer. They had a series of Android phones that were repeatedly getting infected with malware. Why? Well, because their vendor's update server had been compromised. interesting point here. Every time they wiped that malware from the devices, it just reloaded. That was because the update application was actually running as a system process in the background. Something for you to take home. So this is my takeaway from this for you. 2 points. Are you aware of who your external update vendors are? And to what degree automation is used for installation? And finally, Fujitsu. So threat actors leveraged a series of vulnerabilities in it was a sharing and collaboration tool that was being used by Japanese government agencies, some of whom were responsible for planning the Tokyo Olympics. And they were helping themselves to data and sensitive information. This kind of thing is a high-value target. And so that's what I wanted to point out here. Interestingly enough, because of those vulnerabilities, this particular product, known as Project Web, was retired in December of 21. So we're looking at software as a service platform, high-value clients, sensitive data. Probably already are seeing a theme here. How might your organization fit in with this profile? We are so code dependent. Okay, I'm sorry. This right here. Because the fact is, you are trusting not only your vendor, but every vendor of your vendor. Essentially, the third party of your third party. So I want you to think of a recipe, an ingredient list, and all of the things that you're putting in there, butter, eggs, flour, whatever, and where you bought those from. And what if there's a product recall? And we've all seen this with groceries. Well, the same thing applies when we're building things from software and code, and those recalls are quite real. What makes it far more challenging now is we have embedded operating systems and a deluge of IoT to deal with. All right. There we go. Okay. Some facts and figures for you. So, average app has 118 open source libraries. An average library is about 2.5 years old. Your average Java app has 50 open source vulnerabilities. GitHub researcher Maya Kazarowski pointed out that between 85 to 97% of enterprise software code bases come from open source components, and your average project has as many as 203 dependencies. There's a lot that can go wrong there. So if you're not actively doing things like code signing, you're really exposing yourself as an easy target, because it's a trust issue when you are using other people's technology. Need I say more? All right. Like I said, I'm not a coder or a developer, but I had a really deep dive into learning this, and it's important to understand what the CI/CD pipeline is. Continuous integration, continuous delivery. This is fundamental for how development is done. It's a best DevOps practice because it allows for the developers to quickly and effectively build that code and use automation to help them do it more reliably and better. It's consistent. And this is all good. But the one caveat is you are going to be relying on third-party technology in the form of platforms as you are doing this. And those platforms are only as good as we make them to be. And trust me when I say mistakes will be made. A recent example for this is there was almost a third of all packages in PyPy that were automatically executing code when they downloaded. So just think about that. As soon as they download, they run. You don't have any opportunity to get in there and stop something. If that's been tampered with, you're toast. So yes, corresponding with this, because the attackers have picked up on it, are the number of malicious packages out there leveraging this to infect their targets. A good example of what can happen here is with SONARQUBE back in 2020. So this is an open source platform that is used as part of the CI/CD pipeline process. And you can even integrate this into your own networks. Remember, that is third-party technology that you are now trusting in your environs. Well, threat actors had been actively scanning, as they do, for exposed instances of this, and particularly for vulnerable exposed instances. And guess what? There were vulnerabilities for 8 months, because even though this was reported in November, it had happened in April. So for 8 months, the threat actors had access to these code repositories that belong to US government agencies, banks, manufacturing companies, high-level, high-value targets. And they could exfiltrate the data and the proprietary source code. So takeaway for you here, what were those vulnerabilities? They were configuration. They were default passwords and left in. They were default configuration settings left in. Very easy to find and hunt. Who here has played with Shodan and gone looking for things? Yeah, you will find, if you look for it, you will find it. And the sad truth is, we see stories like this every day, and it undermines our best efforts at defense. Okay, so here is a call to action. Some takeaways for you right now, and they come courtesy of the Contrast Labs Open Source Security Report for 2021. What I would call out here is we have to be paying more attention to the open source code that we're using. And we know that attackers go after source code. For example, in the case of SolarWinds, Microsoft stated that attackers had gained some access to Azure, Exchange, and Intune. More recently, if you've been covering this, Lapsus Group. For script kiddies, they did a lot of damage, and they stole a ton of source code. That's going to keep turning up like a bad penny. So when you have the source code as an adversary, this gives you a definite advantage because you can be the first to comb through it and look for vulnerabilities that you get to exploit. Attackers are also leveraging certificates, the things that we trust. And those stolen code signing certificates give them carte blanche to essentially evade detection and then deploy malware from a trusted and legitimate source. There are some really good lessons for us in past attacks. And I'm going to try and call out some of the key learning points as we walk through some of those. What types of attacks do we have? Well, there's vendor compromise, and this is considered among the most sophisticated. There's exploiting third-party applications. That's where you go looking for those valuable 0 days and bugs that you can then manipulate to make that code do things it was never intended to do. There's exploiting open source libraries, which can have their own vulnerabilities, but because they're open source, they're harder to maintain. And also because it's open source, it's an opportunity for attackers to get in there and practice and get better. Something of note was the Apache 2 struts framework. There have been a series of, I believe, 13 0 days in 5 years for this particular open source product. Dependency confusion is an attack that is gaining popularity rapidly, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then hostile takeover. So in 2018, a good example of this was Node.js and EventStream. What happened was the owner of this project was approached by another community member who said they would be willing to take it on in the spirit of collaboration. And this is a very collaborative community. That's how things get done. There's an inherent trust with this. They handed it over. Within a space of a few months, malicious code was being deployed into numerous software applications. And it was stealing credentials from Bitcoin wallets. Now, the attackers had used encryption so that they could hide the functionality. This is important. We're seeing this in other attacks as well. And also, that stolen credential data was being sent off to another server. And again, this is something else we see play out in attacks. Fortunately, the administrators had noticed something and they thought it was a bug, but actually they put a stop to things when they discovered what it really was. So this is a really great lesson for the abuse of trust because it rides on our assumption that software supply chains are to be trusted implicitly, and also for practices that we don't have to verify the creation or the contribution being made with a formal vetting process. I thought this was a very cool diagram of how an attack plays out. And it comes from a report known as the Backstabber's Knife Collection. The link is at the bottom of the page because it does a good summary of open source supply chain attacks. And very simplistically, what happens is you start by injecting malicious code into the dependency tree. Dependency is a word that, wow, it is at the root of all of this. So with that, once you've injected the code into the dependency tree, you can either infect existing packages, or you can inject it right into the source, or you can modify that build system the way we saw in SolarWinds, because once you pwn that, then you're able to taint the downstream packages. Now, as promised, I give you dependency confusion. Okay, so programming languages use package managers. There's Python, which uses pip, Ruby has Ruby gems, and Node.js and JavaScript use something known as NPM. Package managers automate that process of installing and updating dependencies, and they're connected to public code repositories. So you can see the pattern here. One of these could be PyPy with pip. Now, here's the issue. When an organization uses both public and private repos, it creates the situation where you can have one package with the same name in two places. So about a year and a half ago, I would say, security researcher Alex Burson shone a very bright light on this strange possibility, scary possibility, in fact. And he took a hypothesis about a supply chain substitution attack, whereas what if you could do a software installer script that would be pulled as a malicious code file from a public repository instead of from the trusted internal repository using the same name. And then he took this idea and he targeted Apple and Microsoft and Tesla and several other major companies with it. And it worked. It worked so well that 48 hours later, there were a bunch of other people who were uninvited doing the same thing to these companies and more. Several weeks later, there's 10,000 copycat packages on PyPy and NPM from the same thing. So what's important here is that this is still ongoing, and I think that it lowers the bar somewhat, because once you figure out how to do this, it's sly and something for us to keep an awareness of. XCODESPY. Apple uses something called a free application development environment. Again, it's all about that spirit of collaboration. It's far more effective if somebody's created one piece to make it available for everybody else to then build off of. I can see the logic in this too. In March of 2021, there was a new malware variant that was specifically targeting iOS developers in supply chain attacks. They were installing a backdoor on the developers' computers, and then that gave the threat actor a legitimate development environment that was created by Apple. So they had their in. And they were able then to trick victims into adding an online project that was now tainted and malicious into the apps that they were building that would now poison downstream. Takeaway from here is attackers are actively seeking out and targeting developers. They have been for a while, and that's stepping up. And they're targeting those shared sites, those code repositories, those online libraries where the code is uploaded for use by others. It's a great behavior by developers to share their projects, but for attackers, this is a fantastic abuse of trust. And this was truly the wake-up call. December 2020. How many people were dealing with SolarWinds Orion when it happened? Okay, this is a trusted network management and monitoring tool used by the highest levels, by governments, by major manufacturers, by banks, by security firms, by tech firms. And this has been described as the most significant attack of our time. And nobody knew that anything was wrong. What's distinctive about this attack is the degree of stealth, the ability of the threat actors to conceal the length of time that they were in these networks and what they were doing. And this was an operation that clearly took precision for the recon, sophistication to tailor it, and then the patience to wait it out as it executed. Dan Gooden had this to say. It's a good quote, I think. With enough privilege to access the necessary resources, no level of authentication verification is good enough to stop a talented hacker from reaching their end goal. So this is a high-level walkthrough of an anatomy of attack for SolarWinds. And I call out the abuse of trust in the system update process. So what did the attackers do? They compromised that build server in order to poison the downstream feeds for further access and compromise. How did they do this? They abused the MFA protections, multi-factor authentication protections that, again, we trust those to protect us. But the fact is, if the thing that you trust to protect you becomes compromised, so they then took control of a server that was running the Outlook web app and stole the secret token. With that, they bypassed the MFA. They impersonated a global admin account for credentials to cloud applications and resources. And then they gained automated access to cloud resources to evade detection. It's very sophisticated. There's a lot more to it. It's fascinating reading. The more we learn from this, the better we can protect ourselves. CODECOV. This is an online platform that is used for hosting code testing reports and statistics sent up to it by numerous clients. It's trusted. And it provides the developers with tools so that they can quantify just how much source code is executed during testing. They've got 29,000 customers globally, and these are high level, again, GoDaddy, Atlassian, banks, manufacturers. But the impact from this had collateral damage and spread so that it impacted public development projects like Kubernetes and Ansible, and other clients, including Rapid7 and Twilio, who have a lot of clients of their own. So think of those as concentric circles. What happened was this. The attackers leveraged an error in the process that creates the CODECOV Docker image. And then that let them extract credentials. Those credentials were used to protect modification against something called the bash uploader script. That's important because that happens to be the tool that the customers use to send their code coverage reports to the platform. So when that script was modified, it sent details from those code coverage reports to a server external to CODECOV, seeing that over and over again. With that, the attackers were finding goodies, and they were using it to export credentials, tokens, and keys through CODECOV's continuous integration environment, which they could then use to access other things. The KASEYA VSA agent hotfix. This involves managed services providers who are crucial and who are trusted by so many organizations to help them with their IT environments. In this case, attackers exploited more than one vulnerability in the VSA product. And VSA is the server that's used on-prem by the managed services providers in order to manage their clients. The trick here is that unless there is separation, then you have your client environment and your MSP environment that can both be compromised. And that's essentially what happened. So REvil ransomware found and exploited those vulnerabilities, and they were able to get initial access into these managed services providers. It triggered an authentication bypass attack, and they were able to gain an authenticated session, do SQL injection, and achieve code execution in that process. They even tried to disable Microsoft Defender using a signed certificate. Which brings me here. I consider SolarWinds and Log4Shell to be bookend events for our awareness of this subject. Apache Log4j is an open source tool that is used for logging, and it is found in pretty much every Java application environment. It's often deeply embedded in systems, which makes it hard to find and hard to patch. Takeaway one, you need to know your assets, what you have sourced which code from, and where they are. So, in November of 2021, a remote code execution 0-day was identified in Log4j in its data storage and retrieval component, which could have allowed an attacker to gain complete control remotely over a vulnerable system. Spoiler alert, when it was made public on December 9th, that's exactly what was happening. But what this highlights as an attack is the abuse of trust, because Log4j relies on the Java naming and directory interface, API, to look things up from various service providers. And one of those service providers is LDAP. That's the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. But here's the clincher. It doesn't check the LDAP and JNDI requests. There's no input validation. There's no sanitization. This is blind trust. That's just part of the problem, because the big issue here was that this could then make Log4j be used to send any commands and pass input down to sub-processes, even ones that were on unconnected systems later. So we all know what the results were. But in June of this year, CISA warned that Log4Shell remains a threat and will remain a threat for years to come because so many vulnerabilities have not been patched. And then in July, Department of Homeland Services declared it endemic because it was still and so highly vulnerable and would remain so for years to come. All right, let's do a quick look at adversarial inclinations. And there's nothing like a bit of historical context as promised. So it starts with Operation Aurora, and just a quick shout out to a fantastic panel of women that talked about Operation Aurora and the evolution of cybersecurity recently. And that was Leslie Carhart, Heather Adkins, Runa Sandvik, and Nicole Perlroth. In 2009, Operation Aurora served as a wake-up call because Chinese state-sponsored group APT-17 was targeting them. They were targeting Google, Adobe, and other tech companies, as a fact, to get at their source code management systems in order to modify their source code, which is at the heart of supply chain compromise. Well, the event led Google to implement Zero Trust, to figure out how to do lateral movement analysis better and track it, and to put in place improved infrastructure. Interestingly enough, they weren't one of the affected parties named with SolarWinds Orion. In 2017, there was NotPetya. Russian elite hacking team Sandworm, part of the military intelligence service, compromised and took over the software updates for a mandatory accounting package. And this was used throughout the Ukraine. Now, there's no question that Russia has used Ukraine for years as a cyber petri dish to execute weapons, cyber weapons in particular. But in this case, what was supposed to be punitive only to Ukraine spread beyond its confines, and it went on to infect global companies like Maersk. The costs amounted to $10 billion. And then in January of 2019, there was a sophisticated supply chain attack targeting the ASUS Live Update utility. Now, this is a feature that's installed on commercial grade laptops, lots of consumers. You get it at Best Buy. And who doesn't, want to have that convenience, that ease, because this is updating your BIOS automatically, your drivers, all of the things you don't want to have to fiddle with. Heck, even in enterprise environments, we want Windows Update all ready to load automatically so that we don't have to worry about doing it on time. ASUS in 2017 was the 5th largest PC seller, and that makes it a juicy target for an APT. And to highlight, here are some of those Chinese APT groups and the attacks they've been engaged in. I'm just going to quickly go through to call out the nature of these attacks. 2017, KINGSLAYER. They targeted a product, an administrative software package known as EVlog, the kind of thing that governments and military use. Again, the type of prime targets. What did they do? They compromised the vendor's website download page and the update server. And then they used Altair's code signing certificates. Big factor here, maybe even a takeaway, it's still not known who all was compromised in this, and the attack is dated back to 2015. It was only released in 2017 by RSA. SHADOWPAD. This is Chinese group APT17 and Barium. So NetSarang is one of those high-level network management products that are used by governments, military, et cetera. And this was produced by the US and South Korea. The attackers modified the software using an encrypted payload that could be activated remotely. That malicious module in the code library then let them install a backdoor. Through that backdoor, they could then take control. Now, ShadowPad malware is still actively in use and gets regular updates. It's used by multiple Chinese threat actors, so attribution is difficult in this regard. And it was recently seen targeting ICS operations over in Asia and Pakistan. CCleaner. APT17 again at work, this time it's the Axiom group. And they took advantage of a handoff. Puriform was selling this to Avast, and they probably had a lot of confusion at the moment. So what happened was the attackers leveraged reused credentials and one of our favorites, TeamViewer. They used the ShadowPad backdoor so that they could get privilege escalation, and then they altered the source code, distributing that through trusted channels. Also, the use of signed certificates. And I bring you to ShadowPad, APT17, and Barium. Oh, I did that backwards. I'm so sorry. All right. But APT17 and Barium, again, in Shadowhammer. And this we talked about earlier with the ASUS Live Update utility. This one was interesting because it goes after a different group and a chat application leveraged by the government in Mongolia and some of the private sector there. They were able to gain access through a targeted phishing campaign. Then they hijacked that update deployment server and delivered the malware. Call out here, they didn't even engage in signing. There was no code signing. They were active again just this past August, targeting another chat application known as Mimi to deliver the same malware. SignSite. This goes right after your digital code certification. This is believed to have been a Chinese group, possibly TA428, but they targeted Vietnamese government certification authority, and it sends out a package, an actual kit to do this, and it's mandated for a lot of companies there. Well, they had a backdoor on the target systems, and they modified those software installers. And that brings us to GOLDENSPY, which is very interesting because this looks to be government mandated. If you want to do business in China, you have to use this tax software from this provider, which installs a backdoor, and it's embedded. It's also not removable. It's persistent. You can't wipe it, and it gives system-level access to the users. So you could install anything on a system that has this. Ransomware, whatever you want. And yes, it's connected to a CNC that's distinct from that tax software network. Okay, now what do we do? I think we've learned some great things, and I want to ask a quick question. How many of you feel you've learned something more today that will help you better understand the weakest link in your software supply chains of trust? I am so glad. Thank you. Great. Because these are the things we need to do. We have got to look more closely at the open source software and code that we are obtaining. We have to engage better actively in things like code signing. We need to have a registry of record. And we need to leverage the power of SBOM, software, bill of materials. And a shout out to We Are the Cavalry and Josh Corman and a group of people who are doing wonderful work and awareness around this. Because that ingredient list and where you got it from is going to make a real difference. There's going to be more of this to come. But wait, there are more takeaways for you. Yes, we need to move on from our legacy security code analysis tools, and there are things we can use. The Linux Foundation offers us SigStore. And this is for developers so that they can securely sign software artifacts. Think of container images and binaries, bills of material. It's free and open source. Package Hunter is from GitLab. This is also free and open source, and it lets you detect malicious code and unexpected behavior in your dependencies. NIST has a special publication framework to secure software, and we've also got Google, who has introduced SALSA, which is an end-to-end framework to ensure the integrity of software artifacts. And just recently, the Software Delivery Shield, which is a fully managed end-to-end security solution that has modular capabilities that lets you go across your development chain. And here is a list, you can take a photo of this, of links that I hope you can put to good use. And I'll end with this. Oh, did you want me to go back? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that was good. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. All right. Good? Okay. All right. I will end here. I love podcasts, and one of my favorites is Risky Business. They were speaking about Operation Aurora with Mark Rogers from Okta. And here is what they had to say. If you can gain a position of trust, you can exploit that. And think of things like service or non-person IDs in your environments. Accounts that nobody's really paying attention to, but they have capability. They have the privilege to be leveraged and to give you e-discovery to find the things you need to execute that attack. Because your chain is only as good as the weakest link, and there are more ways to abuse that chain of trust than people realize. And with that, thank you all so very much for being here and your time and attention today. Do we have any time for questions?
Yeah, if people want to stick around, you're up for it.
I would be, oh. I would be happy to.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name's Todd from the Department of Defense, National Defense University. And the question I have for you is, should the government be involved with a certification process such as CMMC, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, or should the federal government do a better job of partnering with the private sector to certify companies in terms of their cybersecurity risk profile? Thank you.
Wow, that's a really good question. Should to what extent should the government be involved in the certification process? I always believe in partnership, and you need to have the input from the other side and work with them to understand what's going on at that level. So I would just, as a personal opinion, say to start from that point, to be able to really appreciate what's going on and what constraints they have, because we only know what we know. Did that answer your question? Okay.
To build on that, ma'am, we've been told that many companies. To build on that question, ma'am, I'm Scott from also National Defense University. We've been told that many companies choose not to partner with the NSA and other government agencies. They choose not to open up to be able to get help. How might the government, these agencies that really are there theoretically to help, entice that kind of participation as you just described?
Wow. How can government agencies earn the trust from private sector? There's a lot of history there, and it I'm Canadian.
We can trust our government.
It's really going to, I honestly think it's possible over the duration, because you would have to form personal trusted relationships and build off of that and create a new history. Demonstrating the veracity of the trust that you're placing in these individuals, and then their smaller collectives, so that you have, and the proof of what this gains. I don't think, I think it's very hard for people to move past the images that they have in their mind, and I know that there are core elements that will always be leery of government agencies and certain acronyms for past events and associations. I think everything is possible. I think really going forward, we absolutely have to learn to work together. We have to find a way to talk to each other and bring what we understand to the table. What the NSA knows and sees is of value to all of us, provided that they are able to share that in a way that doesn't compromise national security. And I'm sorry if that's too general a statement. But we have to appreciate what that work means and what it is doing, just as the NSA and the government have to also be able to better understand what private sector businesses are trying to engage in, and the role, and I'll say this, the role that hackers play. Because we need the people who color outside the lines and find the stuff that the rest of us are never, ever going to see. You gotta break a few eggs to make a really great dessert. Okay? All right. I'm available if you need to hit me up online. Otherwise, I'm going to be having a drink, and I hope you'll all come and join me.